The day my family moved into the Willow Creek estates, the sun was just peeking over the tops of the meticulously manicured hedges lining our street. I remember the hush of early morning, broken only by the distant chirping of birds and the soft hum of a lawnmower somewhere. Willow Creek was the kind of community that boasted pristine sidewalks, matching mailboxes, and an almost eerie uniformity in the color of the houses. For my father, who grew up in a boisterous household of 8 siblings, and my mother, who had seen more of the world than most ever would, this neighborhood represented stability and security, a cozy slice of suburban life. However, none of us realized how stringent the Homeowners Association, HOA, would be. While we'd heard secondhand stories of HOAs running small-scale dictatorships in other neighborhoods, we never imagined that Willow Creek would turn out to be the epicenter of some of the most petty disputes any of us had ever witnessed. We especially never expected that one woman would stand at the heart of it all, Karen Brentwood. We were warned not to call her Karen to her face, but everyone in the neighborhood, behind closed doors, called her that with a frustrated roll of the eyes. When the moving truck backed into our driveway, Mom directed the movers with a confident, gentle authority, traits she had honed during her years in the Special Forces. She never boasted about her past, nor did she wear it on her sleeve. Mom was the sort of person who exuded calmness even in the most tumultuous situations. Even though she'd retired from her military career, her posture was always erect, her gaze unwavering, and her voice collected. Rarely did she ever raise her tone. Usually, a single sharp glance was enough to communicate that she meant business. That morning, as we lugged in boxes full of kitchenware and carefully labeled items, Karen made her debut. She strutted down the sidewalk, posture rigid, her short-cropped brown hair sprayed in a way that suggested she had spent hours, possibly days, fixing it just so. She wore a tailored blazer, slacks, and a brooch shaped like a flower pinned to the lapel. Clutched in her right hand was a slim folder. "Hello, new neighbors," she called out, though the smile on her face failed to mask a cold sharpness in her eyes. "I'm Brenda." She hesitated, then corrected herself. My name is Karen Brentwood. I am the head of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association. I just wanted to extend a neighborly greeting on behalf of all of us." Mom wiped her forehead with the back of her hand. She extended a hand in greeting. "Thank you. My name is Christine Taylor. We're happy to be here. This is my husband." Karen waved off the rest of the introduction, focusing her gaze intently on Mom. It was as though nobody else existed in that moment. "Wonderful, wonderful. I have a few pamphlets for you. Just basic guidelines and community expectations, of course. You'll find everything you need in here. Rules about paint color, lawn maintenance, mailbox decorations, garbage bin placement, acceptable types of fencing, pet regulations, and so on." Dad took the folder from her, a bit dumbfounded by the thickness of what was supposed to be a pamphlet. There had to be at least 30 pages of text in there. I saw him open his mouth to say something witty, but quickly reconsider as he caught a glimpse of Karen's unblinking stare. "That's quite a lot," Mom remarked calmly, shutting the back of the moving truck. She lifted a small box of books and nodded politely. "We'll make sure to read it." Karen's lips twitched, hovering between a forced smile and a frown. She seemed, at once, both satisfied to have done her due diligence and irritated that we weren't showing immediate obeisance. "Perfect. I'll be by later in the week. And remember," she added, "the Willow Creek Estates adheres to strict compliance. We pride ourselves on uniform excellence." With that parting statement, Karen marched back down the sidewalk. Dad and I locked eyes, baffled by the aura of severity emanating from that woman. Mom just gave us both a small shrug. She was used to more intense personalities in her line of work, although I doubted she had ever dealt with someone quite like Karen in a suburban environment. Unloading the rest of our boxes was uneventful. We set up the house, piece by piece. Mom hung up a few paintings she'd collected during her tours overseas. Dad carefully unwrapped and placed his prized coffee machine on the kitchen counter, as though bestowing a relic in a sacred temple. I carried my own boxes up to my new bedroom, grateful to have a space with a window that offered a pleasant view of the sunset over the wide yard. But that sense of peace only lasted until the next morning, when Karen returned, this time with an even thicker binder in her arms. She insisted on walking Mom and Dad through the additional bylaws about neighborhood watch guidelines, community decor standards, and personal conduct. It was becoming painfully apparent that, here in Willow Creek Estates, the HOA was less of a guiding body and more of an authoritarian regime. Nevertheless, we were determined to put our best foot forward. We wanted this house to be our home. And maybe, just maybe, the rules wouldn't be too arduous to follow once we settled in. We had no idea how quickly that notion would be shattered. About a week after moving in, I found myself standing in our driveway, admiring the boxwood hedge Dad had planted along the border. Mom was inside reading over yet another document from Karen about the monthly aesthetic alignment inspection. While it all sounded ridiculous to me, Mom calmly pointed out that we had known about the presence of an HOA before moving here and that we should adapt. Dad was less thrilled, calling it the empire of pettiness, but Mom simply gave him that look of quiet patience. I had been focusing on my phone, scrolling aimlessly through messages, when I heard a voice that made me jump. "Excuse me." Karen's voice. I nearly dropped my phone. She stood in the street, wearing another immaculate blazer and her signature expression of subdued disdain. Her eyes flicked toward me, then back toward the hedge. "Who planted these shrubs?" she asked, her words clipped. "My dad did," I replied warily. Karen rummaged through the binder she was carrying, a different one than the last time, with the HOA's insignia emblazoned on the cover. "I don't see a request for new shrubbery in the landscaping permissions. Did you submit the appropriate form to the grounds committee?" My eyebrows shot up. "Grounds committee? Isn't that you? Or part of the HOA you oversee?" Karen glowered, as though my question was inherently insolent. "We have a distinct approval process. Per the guidelines, all new plantings must be submitted with a color photograph, the scientific name of the species, and projected growth estimates. Approval usually takes 4 to 6 weeks, sometimes longer." She gave the shrubs a pointed look, as though they offended her personal sense of order. "I'm afraid these will have to be removed until proper approval is given." I stared at her, unsure how to respond. My father, hearing voices, stepped out of the garage. "What's going on?" Karen spun on her heel, her high-heeled shoes clicking on the driveway. "These shrubs are in violation of Bylaw 4B, Section 2. They will need to be removed immediately." Dad set down a hammer he'd been carrying. "Removed? Lady, these are just boxwoods. They match the rest of the yard." I didn't think. "Well, that's exactly the problem," Karen cut him off. "You didn't think. Here at Willow Creek, we do things the right way, not the convenient way. Now, I suggest you dig them up and dispose of them. If you don't comply, we'll be forced to fine you. After repeated fines, we may consider further action." As she laid down this ultimatum, her eyes shimmered with that cold satisfaction I'd seen so often in people who relish small shows of power. Dad inhaled, preparing to unleash a torrent of indignation, but Mom appeared just in time, stepping outside with a calm air. She smiled politely at Karen. "There seems to be a misunderstanding. We weren't aware we needed permits for basic landscaping. Could you point us to the exact form so we can rectify this?" Karen stiffened. Perhaps she had expected a fight and was disappointed not to get one. "It's a green form labeled Request for Horticultural Modification, Subcategory A. Just be sure it's filed before you plant anything next time. As for the existing shrubs, I'll allow a 1-week grace period for you to remove them. After that, you'll be fined $50 per day until they're gone." Mom thanked her without blinking, and Karen stalked off, presumably in search of the next aesthetic misdemeanor. Dad glared, his frustration evident, but Mom merely shrugged and placed a comforting hand on his arm. "We'll figure this out," she said. "We should probably read those guidelines a bit more closely." Dad muttered something under his breath about living under a tyranny, and I sympathized. But for the moment, we complied. We decided we'd replant the shrubs later, after filing the required paperwork, so we dug them up and stored them in pots in the backyard. It seemed ridiculous, but Mom was adamant. "Pick your battles." Little did we know, we would soon face a battle we never saw coming. Despite the fiasco with the shrubs, life in Willow Creek Estates continued. The houses were beautiful in that cookie-cutter way, the streets were safe, and the community had some perks, like a swimming pool and a small park where families could gather. On the surface, it was suburban bliss. However, beneath that veneer, tension simmered. Karen was ubiquitous. Her presence felt in every corner of the neighborhood. Overly bright pink violation slips appeared on residents' doors for trivial transgressions. A trash bin left out an hour too long, a weed sprouting in the walkway. A child's bike leaned against a garage door instead of stored away. These petty little checks on everyone's behavior led to hushed, resentful conversations. I overheard more than one person refer to her behind her back as Her Royal Highness or the Grand Inquisitor. The legend of Karen grew with every news story of her micromanaging fiascos. And yet, she was not alone in her self-righteous cause. Some neighbors, either out of fear or sycophantic devotion, supported her wholeheartedly. They believed that the orderliness of Willow Creek must be preserved at all costs. Property values, they would say, as though that justified every invasion of privacy or petty display of control. My father found these rules stifling, but he tried to abide by them, if only to keep peace for Mom's sake. I did not retire to a place where I can't plant a shrub without a permission slip, he'd often complain. But we all found ways to manage. Our mailbox was exactly the right shade of slate gray, our lawn never exceeded the mandated maximum of 2 inches, and our trash cans were hidden behind a fence we had erected, with proper permits, for the sole purpose of containing them. Mom, having known far more stressful environments, took it all in stride. She rarely exhibited any annoyance, focusing instead on the positives: a nice neighborhood for me to grow up in, a stable place for Dad to tinker with his home projects, and the promise of relative peace. But that peace only lasted until a rumor began circulating that the HOA was considering new measures for gate security. Willow Creek Estates had a gated entrance, staffed by a small team of private security guards. For most people, the guardhouse was more of a formality than anything else. The community was situated in a low-crime area. Yet Karen, citing an increase in suspicious behavior, lobbied for additional measures: mandatory searches for visitors, the installation of more cameras, and expanded authority for the guards. "It's for our safety," she insisted in a meeting, according to the neighbor who told us about it. "We want to prevent criminals or vandals from sneaking in under the guise of visiting friends or family." These proposals made many residents uneasy, especially because it essentially handed the guards more power to intrude on people's private lives. Yet Karen bulldozed over any objections, touting the possibility of dramatic insurance benefits and heightened property values. She was adept at twisting logic to make her draconian measures sound beneficial. One day, Mom had an unexpected encounter at the guardhouse. She was returning from the local shooting range, one of her pastimes ever since she retired. She owned her firearms legally, had all the necessary permits, and was an expert in weapon safety. Despite that, the guard on duty, a man named Steve Norris, eyed her suspiciously as she pulled up to the gate. "Pop the trunk, ma'am," he said, voice gruff. Mom arched an eyebrow from the driver's seat. "I don't see why that's necessary. This is a gated community. I live here. My ID is right here." She held out her identification card. Steve frowned. "We're implementing new policies. The HOA wants us to check for contraband. Please comply, or I can't let you in." Mom stared at him for a few seconds. She reached for her phone and dialed Dad, who was at home. "There seems to be a new policy at the gate. You know anything about this?" she asked calmly. I could hear Dad's muffled response from where I sat in the passenger seat. He knew nothing. None of us had been informed of any changes that required trunk searches for residents. Mom sighed. Then, quietly, she placed the phone on speaker, letting Dad listen in. "Sir," she said to Steve, "this is a private community, and I am a homeowner. I pay dues for that gate. Unless you have probable cause or some legitimate complaint, you do not have the right to search my vehicle." Steve's cheeks reddened. He leaned in closer, glaring at her. "Look, I'm just following orders. I have to see what's in your trunk." Mom gave him a placid smile. "I understand you have orders. Could you please produce the written mandate from the HOA board that states I must submit to a search of my vehicle?" Steve hesitated, then shook his head. "I don't have that. The order came from Ms. Brentwood in an email." "Then please step aside. Unless you have a legitimate reason to suspect me of a crime, you cannot detain me. This is still a civil matter, not a military or police checkpoint." For a few seconds, it seemed Steve might escalate the situation, but he faltered. Finally, he huffed and lifted the barrier, allowing Mom to pass. I didn't realize it then, but that incident sowed the seeds for a more significant confrontation. Word spread that Mom had effectively told the guard, "No," and wasn't fined or penalized. A few neighbors quietly applauded her stance. The more fearful or compliance-oriented ones simply shook their heads and said, "Just do what they say. It's easier." As for Karen, rumor had it that she was livid about Mom's refusal to play by her new security rules. Behind the scenes, she began a concerted campaign to ensure that all residents would fall in line. And if certain people, like my mother, refused, Karen intended to make an example of them. The tension grew thicker after that day. Karen's supporters, let's call them the HOA loyalists, began to shun not just Mom, but our entire family. We found fewer cordial greetings whenever we strolled down the sidewalk, and more disapproving glares. Despite having done nothing illegal, we had apparently violated some unwritten code of docile obedience. In contrast, the other faction of residents, those who privately chafed against the HOA's overreach, became friendlier toward us. They would greet Mom in hushed, conspiratorial tones. One neighbor, an elderly gentleman named Mr. Dempsey, whispered to Mom one afternoon, "I'm glad someone finally stood up to them. They've been pushing these rules for years, but we never dared say no." We eventually learned that many other families had faced intimidation tactics. Late-night knocks on the door with warnings about a trash can being too visible, or threatened fines for a single missing slat in a backyard fence. Most paid up, too tired or too fearful to resist. Karen had effectively turned Willow Creek Estates into a petty fiefdom, with the HOA board acting as her vassals. Throughout all this, Mom maintained her characteristic calm. She would smile politely, remind us that we were in the right, and proceed with our day. Dad, for all his grumbling, followed her lead. Even I, who had previously felt overshadowed by the stress of uprooting from our old home, began to see my mother in a new light. She was the embodiment of disciplined composure. In a sense, dealing with the HOA's theatrics was child's play compared to the real-life risks she had faced in her military career. Yet, for all her calm, I could sense a storm brewing behind her gaze. Some part of her recognized that Karen was not simply an annoying busybody. She was an individual who thrived on control and possessed a knack for manipulating rules to her advantage. Karen had already begun stepping up her campaign. We noticed more guards at the gate, new forms in our mailbox demanding compliance affidavits, and neighbors cautioning us that Karen was threatening mass fines for anyone who wouldn't submit to random vehicle checks. It was about that time I first heard from an acquaintance at school that the local police were aware of what was going on. A friend's father, who worked in law enforcement, mentioned offhand that they had received multiple calls from Willow Creek residents complaining of harassment by the HOA. However, because the HOA existed under private, contractual agreements, the police's hands were largely tied. Mom's single biggest advantage was her training and her rock-solid understanding of her rights. She meticulously researched local statutes and the boundaries of HOA authority. She made sure that we, as homeowners, understood exactly where that line was, and that if Karen crossed it, we would have legal recourse. Then came the day when everything changed. Karen decided to cross that line in the most glaring way imaginable, and all the subtlety she had once employed fell aside. It was at the front gate, late one afternoon, when the neighborhood's well-oiled facade finally cracked. It was a warm Friday evening when Mom drove up to the Willow Creek gate after a grocery run. I was with Dad at home, helping him fix a squeaky cabinet door in the kitchen. We expected her back any minute. Little did we know that she would arrive at the neighborhood entrance to find a new guard on duty, someone we'd never seen before. His name, as we later learned, was Clyde Hansen, and he was a recent hire on Karen's direct recommendation. Clyde was tall, broad-shouldered, and, according to onlookers, visibly nervous. He clutched a shotgun at his side. Not just a sidearm, not just a baton, but a full-fledged, pump-action shotgun. It was a bizarre sight in the placid surroundings of Willow Creek Estates. Residents who had just finished their evening walks gawked from a distance, unsure what was going on. Mom pulled up in the family SUV, calm as ever. She offered her ID to Clyde. "Christine Taylor, homeowner. I live on Maple Court." Clyde swallowed hard. "Step out of the vehicle, ma'am." Mom kept her hands on the steering wheel. "Is there a problem? Ms. Brentwood said you might be carrying contraband or an unauthorized weapon." Mom's expression remained unruffled. "I have a legal permit to carry. No contraband. I'm retired military, and all my weapons are registered. If Ms. Brentwood wants to search my car, she can do so with a legal warrant." Clyde tightened his grip on the shotgun. Witnesses would later recount how his knuckles went white against the metal. "Ma'am," he began, "I won't ask you again. Step out and let me check your trunk." At that moment, Karen stepped into view, flanked by two of her loyal HOA colleagues. She wore a smirk that hinted she had orchestrated this entire scene. She had presumably convinced Clyde that he had the authority to forcibly search residents' vehicles, that the mere mention of HOA bylaws conferred near-legal powers. Mom glanced at Karen. "You're making a mistake, Ms. Brentwood. The guard cannot force a search without a legitimate reason." Karen's smirk grew. "We have every right to secure our community. You, Ms. Taylor, are a threat." Mom inhaled, slow and measured. She unclicked her seatbelt. "I am no threat. If you feel threatened, you can contact the authorities." She pointedly looked at the phone attached to the guardhouse wall. "Go ahead. Call the local police. Otherwise, let me pass." It might have ended there, had Clyde not raised the shotgun. With trembling hands, he aimed it at Mom's driver's side window. "Do not move," Clyde shouted. His voice cracked. A wave of shock rippled among the onlookers. This was no longer an HOA policy issue. This was a dangerous escalation. Karen, standing off to the side, seemed startled by how quickly the situation had spiraled, but her eyes betrayed a cold satisfaction. She had set this up, and now it was playing out like a stage drama. Mom froze, her training kicking in. She had been in far more dangerous standoffs before, a shaky guard brandishing a weapon paled compared to the threats she'd faced overseas. Without flinching, she slowly raised both hands, palms outward to show she posed no threat. "Clyde," she said, voice steady and calm. "Put the gun down." He shook his head, sweat beading on his brow. "I have orders from Ms. Brentwood. I'm authorized to use force if I suspect a security breach." Karen's voice chimed in. "We have a right to protect ourselves, Christine. You can't just waltz in here with unapproved firearms." Mom shifted slightly, hands still up. "I have a permit. You're not a law enforcement officer. You have no legal authority to point that weapon at me." For a moment, no one moved. Then Clyde cocked the shotgun. The sound echoed across the quiet road. Neighbors stood rooted in place, gasping. Fear flickered over Karen's features for a split second, as though she herself hadn't anticipated that her newest recruit might actually pull the trigger. But pride, or maybe arrogance, kept her from intervening. My mother, her reflexes honed by years of military service, recognized the immediate danger. She had carried her sidearm that day. Ironically, she had come from the local gun store earlier to pick up new cleaning supplies. She never traveled with her weapon in an unsafe condition, nor did she wave it around. It was holstered discreetly at her waist, hidden beneath a light jacket. Mom looked directly at Clyde. Her tone was unyielding, a command voice. "Son, you do not want to do this. Lower your weapon before someone gets hurt." Clyde's stance wavered. He was out of his depth. "Step out of the car," he barked, but the authority in his voice cracked. That was the opening Mom needed. With a single motion so fluid that witnesses would later describe it as a blur, she slid out of her seat, stepped away from the line of the shotgun, and pivoted around the open car door. She didn't draw her weapon yet. She was giving Clyde every chance to back down. But his nerves betrayed him. "Stop," he screeched, jabbing the barrel in Mom's direction. Mom raised one hand, speaking in a calm, measured tone. "Don't do this. I'm a retired service member. This is not the place or the reason to use lethal force." Mom's right hand hovered near her jacket, and everyone watching knew. If Clyde squeezed that trigger, if any sense of imminent harm was present, she was trained to respond in an instant. The neighbors gawked, hearts pounding. Karen's arrogant smirk trembled, replaced by uncertainty. Still pointing the shotgun, Clyde took a step back, uncertain how to proceed. His eyes darted to Karen, but she offered no guidance, no rescue. She seemed paralyzed, perhaps realizing that she was playing with fire. And in that moment, Clyde's nerve broke. He lowered the barrel, shoulders sagging. The tension in the air dissipated, if only slightly. Mom exhaled calmly. "Thank you. Now, kindly put the gun down on the ground." "That's it. Nice and easy." Looking at her with a mixture of awe and fear, Clyde gently set the shotgun on the asphalt. Karen's colleagues took several steps back, suddenly desperate to distance themselves from the fiasco. Karen herself wore a stunned expression, as though she'd lost control of the script she'd penned. It was then that Mom calmly produced her phone and dialed 911. She calmly reported, for all to hear that an armed individual had threatened her at the gates of Willow Creek Estates. The operator confirmed that the police were on their way. All around them, neighbors whispered in shock. Moments later, the gates to Willow Creek opened, and a hush fell as a police cruiser, lights flashing, pulled up to the guard booth. The police arrived swiftly, responding to a call of an armed standoff in a usually quiet neighborhood. Officers stepped out, hands on their service weapons, ready for the worst. Fortunately, the immediate threat had passed. Mom stood to the side, calmly speaking to a neighbor who had witnessed the entire episode. Clyde stood near the guardhouse, hands up, pale with fear. Karen, for her part, tried to interject herself. She approached the senior officer, gesturing wildly at Mom. She's the one you should question. She has a firearm in her car, and she refused a security check. Our HOA mandated. The officer, a tall woman with a no-nonsense gaze, cut Karen off. Ma'am, I need you to take a step back and keep your voice down. Karen blinked and used to being dismissed. But, step back, ma'am, the officer repeated firmly. Karen finally complied, fury written across her face. In short order, the officers assessed the situation. They retrieved the shotgun from the ground. Clyde was disarmed and placed in cuffs while they sorted out the details. Mom handed over her concealed carry permit and answered questions in a calm, respectful manner. She explained exactly what had happened, starting from Clyde demanding to search her vehicle under Karen's orders, to him raising the shotgun. Several neighbors corroborated her story. Even the few loyalists who had accompanied Karen to the gate were forced to admit that Clyde had pointed the weapon first. One neighbor, trembling, told the officer, "I thought he was going to shoot her. She never even reached for her gun until he cocked that shotgun." Another chipped in, "She handled it like a pro. Didn't escalate, didn't threaten. She just defused him." The officers took statements, checked IDs, and eventually guided Clyde into the back of the police cruiser. Meanwhile, Karen hovered nearby, clearly rattled, but determined to salvage some measure of control. She latched onto the officer's sleeve as the woman turned to leave. "Officer," Karen insisted, "she can't be allowed to carry that firearm freely in this community. We have rules." The officer gave Karen a level stare. "Ma'am, this is the United States. Ms. Taylor has a valid concealed carry permit, recognized under our state's laws. She hasn't violated any statutes." Her gaze hardened. "But if your guard threatened her with a shotgun, that's a serious offense. He could be charged with assault, possibly worse." Karen's lip quivered. "But our HOA." The officer's gaze flicked down to Karen's name badge, which read Head of Willow Creek HOA. "An HOA does not override state or federal law, Miss Brentwood. That's a matter for the courts." At that, Karen bristled. She took a step back, lips pursed, her carefully painted face reddening with indignation. The cruelty of the real world had poked a hole in her bubble of control. Clyde's misguided aggression, stoked by her directive, had drawn the attention of actual law enforcement. This was no longer a matter of petty fines or brash intimidation. Officers asked Mom if she needed medical attention. She shook her head, explaining that she was fine. It was clear that she had walked away physically unscathed. Mentally, it was a different story. "I remember her pulling into the driveway after everything settled. Dad and I rushed out." She relayed the incident in a calm, almost detached tone, as if recounting a training exercise. "But I knew it was more than that." There was a subtle tremble in her voice. That night, as the sun set over the pristine rooftops, half the neighborhood buzzed with talk of the day's events. Word spread quickly. The new guard had nearly shot Christine Taylor at the gate under Karen's orders. The story took on a life of its own, with details exaggerated or swapped. By day's end, it was widely understood that Karen had gone too far, and that she might finally face real consequences. In the weeks that followed, the police investigation churned on. Clyde was charged with aggravated assault, among other potential offenses. Mom cooperated fully with the authorities, providing every detail she could remember. She also supplied them with evidence of the HOA's excessive security demands, emails, notices, and second-hand accounts from neighbors who had been harassed. The police listened carefully, but they also had a limit. Some matters, like fining residents for minor infractions, were civil, not criminal. Yet the standoff at the gate had raised eyebrows in local government. Some city council members wanted a thorough review of Willow Creek's HOA practices. They questioned how Karen had managed to recruit such aggressive guards, and why she believed she had the power to enforce borderline vigilante measures. Investigators requested that Karen produce all official HOA meeting minutes, emails, and budget records. Karen tried to stonewall. She went on a crusade of denial. "We have nothing to hide. Everything we do is for the safety of our residents." But the requests persisted, and soon, Karen found herself in a bind. Under the threat of a court subpoena, she handed over reams of documents, some of which revealed shady financial dealings. Rumors quickly spread that Karen had been misappropriating HOA funds for years, funneling them into personal ventures under the guise of improvement projects that never materialized. The more investigators dug, the more troubling details emerged. One of the biggest red flags: monthly payments to a security consultancy that didn't exist anywhere but on paper. It became apparent that Karen was quietly building a private force of guards, paying them from the HOA's pot, all while telling the rest of the neighborhood their dues were going toward landscaping and administrative costs. Neighbors who'd once been neutral or even supportive of Karen started demanding answers. They wanted to see exactly where their fees were going and why. Meanwhile, Karen clung desperately to her position. She still had her loyalists, who believed that any move to remove her was an overreaction, that everything she did was for the collective good. Yet that group dwindled by the day as new revelations about her questionable spending surfaced. This was the climate in which our family found itself. We had moved to Willow Creek for tranquility and found ourselves in the middle of a neighborhood fiasco that was rapidly spiraling into outright scandal. Mom tried her best to remain detached from the drama, but she was inevitably drawn in. She was a central figure, after all, the woman who'd nearly been shot because of Karen's misguided policies. Meanwhile, I watched as Dad became more outspoken. Initially, he'd wanted to keep a low profile, but after the guard incident, he publicly condemned Karen's actions. At an impromptu neighborhood gathering held near the front gate, Dad spoke up for the first time. "This woman set in motion a chain of events that could have gotten my wife killed. This is not about shrubs, paint colors, or mailbox designs. It's about the fundamental difference between right and wrong." He received a wave of applause, something that might have shocked him. And from that moment onward, it was as though the residents realized that they too had a voice. One by one, they began to share their horror stories. Some felt coerced into paying questionable fines. Others had discovered weird fees tacked onto their HOA statements with no explanation. The community was waking up. Karen, however, refused to back down. She continued to hold on to power, even as the inquiries mounted against her. She insisted on holding monthly compliance audits and threatened to withhold privileges, like using the community pool, for those who wouldn't bow to her authority. But her iron grip on Willow Creek was slipping. Too many people had seen the lengths she was willing to go to in order to keep control. At night, I would find Mom and Dad quietly discussing the situation over cups of tea in the living room. Mom would calmly explain what the police had asked her, and Dad would mutter about the sheer insanity of it all. Yet, despite the darkness swirling around Willow Creek, I felt an odd sense of camaraderie among the residents, like we had all collectively realized we were better off supporting one another rather than cowering before the HOA. The final showdown began at a special HOA board meeting, convened at the urging of concerned residents who demanded answers. The meeting took place in the community center, a large hall typically used for holiday gatherings and gardening workshops. That night, it was filled to capacity with anxious, curious, and sometimes angry homeowners. Many had been living under Karen's reign for years. Others, like us, were relatively new, but had already witnessed enough to understand the severity of the situation. Karen sat at the head of a long table, flanked by her few remaining supporters, clutching a stack of papers. She wore a navy blue pantsuit and a no-nonsense expression, but her carefully arranged facade was cracking under the weight of the swirling accusations. The meeting commenced with a reading of the minutes from the last official session. Then, a representative from the city council, who had been called in to observe, stepped forward and began to outline the concerns: budget discrepancies, unauthorized security protocols, complaints of harassment, and the fiasco at the gate. Karen tried to maintain composure, but her voice quivered. "These claims are exaggerated," she insisted. "We've always acted in the best interest of the community." And the guard, Clyde, was just inexperienced. We can't be held responsible for his misunderstanding of the rules. But the audience wasn't buying it. Neighbors stood up to share their grievances. A woman described how she was fined $200 for having a potted plant on her front steps that didn't match the required color scheme. A young couple recounted being threatened with eviction for letting their children draw with chalk on the sidewalk. An older man revealed how he had been forced to pay repeated inspection fees for a lawn repair that never seemed to meet Karen's mysterious standards. Story after story poured out, exposing a long history of overreach. At one point, the city council representative interjected, telling the crowd that there was significant evidence of financial improprieties. He stated that an independent audit would be initiated to track every cent of HOA funds. Karen turned pale. She clung to her seat, eyes darting nervously among the outraged residents. Then, as if on cue, the double doors at the back of the hall opened. Two uniformed police officers entered, commanding attention. Murmurs swept the room. One of the officers approached the table, a folded piece of paper in hand. He eyed Karen. "Ms. Brentwood." She stood, chin raised, as if still believing she could talk her way out. "Yes." The officer unfurled the document. "We have a warrant for your arrest on suspicion of fraud and embezzlement of HOA funds. Additional charges may follow as the investigation proceeds." An audible gasp rippled through the crowd. Karen's face crumpled, horror etched into every line. She sputtered, "But this is a misunderstanding. I only used the funds for community improvements." No one seemed convinced. The officer stepped forward. "Ma'am, please place your hands behind your back." Too stunned to resist, Karen complied. In that charged moment, the neighborhood collectively realized that the tide had finally turned. She was led away in handcuffs, her meticulously controlled empire in ruins. Karen's arrest was the climax of the scandal. The local media picked up the story, plastering headlines like "HOA Gone Wild" and "Rogue Leader Embezzles Funds, Endangers Residents." News vans rolled through Willow Creek estates for days, interviewing anyone who would speak. Some neighbors reveled in the attention, others shied away, too exhausted by the drama to want any part of it. The police investigation, now backed by the district attorney's office, peeled back layer after layer of Karen's misconduct. Bank statements revealed tens of thousands of dollars siphoned from the HOA accounts into private bank accounts linked to Karen. She had purchased a new SUV in cash and had bankrolled expensive vacations, all on the dime of Willow Creek residents. Meanwhile, additional charges piled up related to the gate standoff. Clyde, who had threatened Mom with a shotgun, decided to cooperate in exchange for leniency. He testified that Karen expressly instructed him to search vehicles for contraband at gunpoint if necessary, telling him it was perfectly legal under HOA authority. That blatant misinformation, combined with the threat of violence, dug Karen into an even deeper hole. But for many residents, the biggest relief was intangible. The oppressive atmosphere that had hovered over Willow Creek estates had finally lifted. Without Karen's watchful eyes and her legion of petty enforcers, people breathed easier. Neighbors began repainting their doors in different colors, planting flowers without reams of paperwork, and chatting openly in the street. The sense of a true community was returning. Shortly before Karen's trial, she faced a civil lawsuit from the residents for misappropriating their funds. The court issued an order freezing her assets, including her house. Rumors swirled that she might lose everything: her property, her savings, and her membership in the Willow Creek community she once lorded over. Suddenly, the possibility of Karen behind bars was very real. In the end, that's exactly what happened. After a lengthy trial in which multiple witnesses testified about her intimidation tactics, embezzlement, and role in the violent standoff at the gate, the jury found Karen guilty on multiple felony counts. She was sentenced to prison time, with the judge admonishing her for betraying the trust of her community. Additionally, the court ordered that her property be seized and auctioned to help repay the HOA members she had defrauded. The final scene of Karen's once glamorous life in Willow Creek saw her led away to a transport vehicle, a far cry from her days of strutting around the neighborhood in tailored blazers and brandishing bylaws as if they were gospel. Today, the guardhouse at Willow Creek Estates still stands, but the atmosphere has changed. Instead of armed guards, the community employs a simple electronic gate system. If visitors need to check in, it's a quick and friendly process. The new HOA board, elected in the wake of Karen's downfall, is made up of residents who want to ensure that the rules remain fair and transparent. They've scaled back many of the unnecessary restrictions, focusing on the actual upkeep of the neighborhood rather than micromanaging every detail of people's lives. My mother remains the quiet hero of the story, though she never labels herself as such. She never asked for recognition, and as far as she's concerned, she simply stood up for what was right. Still, the neighbors haven't forgotten. They often wave her over to chat, sharing a friendly smile that says, "Thank you for leading the charge, even when you didn't mean to." Dad has found new joy in re-landscaping our yard, without needing a mountain of paperwork. I've watched him replant the boxwood shrubs that started the whole feud, this time with no one telling him they violate any imaginary rule. He jokes that every little leaf is a middle finger raised in tribute to Karen's downfall, which always makes me laugh. As for me, I think back on the chaos that once ruled these manicured streets. If there's one lesson I learned, it's that the quiet acceptance of injustice only breeds more of it. It takes someone courageous, someone disciplined and principled, like my mom, to say enough and stand up against a bully. Whether that bully wields a rifle, a pen, or a copy of the HOA bylaws, the only real authority they have is the authority we allow them to seize. Willow Creek Estates is no utopia, but it's a far kinder place now. Neighbors look after one another, not out of obligation or fear, but out of genuine concern. We have block parties, potluck dinners, and all the normal trappings of a suburban community that isn't overshadowed by a tyrannical figure. The memory of Karen's reign lingers, but it serves as a reminder of how fragile peace can be when people surrender their rights to a power-hungry individual. And so the saga of Karen Brentwood, the self-appointed dictator of Willow Creek Estates, came to a close, not with a triumphant speech from her, but with the clang of a jail cell door. Her property confiscated, her reputation in tatters, she reaped the final harvest of her arrogance and aggression. The story of her downfall is still whispered around the neighborhood whenever a new resident moves in. "You think the HOA is strict now?" they'll say. "You should have seen it when Karen was in charge." And then someone will inevitably point to the gate and recount how a reckless guard, under Karen's command, once leveled a shotgun at a mild-mannered resident's mother, who turned out to be the toughest person in the entire community. Life moves on. The grass grows. The sun sets over the identical rooftops. And Willow Creek, free from Karen's tyranny, stands as a reminder that sometimes it takes just one person to stare down a bully's barrel and refuse to blink.